Have you ever wondered what the deepest form of love looks like from space? For 3 decades, Thomas Evergreen woke before dawn every weekend, loaded his truck with saplings, and drove 2 hours to a forgotten wasteland that most people avoided. No one knew why this aging man disappeared regularly, returning home with dirt-crusted hands and an exhausted smile. His neighbors assumed he was pursuing a harmless hobby, perhaps fishing or hiking. They never imagined he was creating something so vast it would eventually capture the attention of NASA scientists. When satellite images revealed a perfect heart-shaped forest stretching across miles of what was once toxic industrial land, environmental researchers were stunned. But it was what lay inside the heart that would bring millions around the world to tears. A name, spelled out in redwood trees that stood taller than all others. Elena. The revelation would forever change how we understand devotion, grief, and one person's power to heal not just a landscape, but an entire community's relationship with the earth itself. This is the story of a promise kept in soil and leaves, and the extraordinary ripple effects when a private act of love becomes a public miracle. The satellite analyst nearly scrolled past it. Sarah Chen had been reviewing environmental recovery zones for hours, her eyes glazing over as she compared vegetation density maps across decades of imagery. The data was important, crucial even, for the Environmental Restoration Institute's annual report, but 14 straight hours of pixel analysis had dulled her usually sharp attention. Just finished the Midwestern sector, she muttered to herself, suppressing a yawn as the clock approached midnight. Her cursor dragged across another section of reclaimed industrial land in western Ohio, a region notorious for its history of chemical manufacturing and subsequent abandonment in the 1980s. That's when an anomaly caught her eye. At first, Sarah thought it was a processing error. A perfect heart-shaped pattern of dense vegetation where there should be nothing but the brownish-gray signature of contaminated soil. She zoomed in, adjusting the time slider to view historical imagery. 25 years ago, nothing but wasteland. 20 years, tiny specks of green in an organized pattern. 15 years, distinct lines forming. 10 years, unmistakably deliberate. Today, a massive, lush heart of trees, with what appeared to be a name. That's impossible, Sarah whispered, calling up soil quality reports for the region. The area had been declared permanently compromised after the chemical plant's toxic legacy rendered it unsuitable for natural recovery. Yet here was a forest, not just growing, but thriving in intricate, intentional patterns. She picked up her phone and dialed her supervisor, Dr. Harrison, despite the late hour. "You need to see this," she said when he answered, voice groggy with sleep. "I think someone's been secretly terraforming the grimly chemical wasteland for decades, and they've turned it into art." 300 miles away, Thomas Evergreen sat on his porch swing, gnarled hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea. At 68, his body ached more than it didn't these days. Tomorrow was Saturday, planting day, and his joints were already protesting the work to come. But the calendar hanging by his door had been marked with green X's for 1,560 Saturdays without fail, and tomorrow would be no different. On the small table beside him sat a dog-eared notebook, its pages filled with meticulous planting schedules, growth projections, and hand-drawn maps. The latest entry, written in cramped handwriting, read, "Section E22 complete. Starting the final curve of the A tomorrow. 5 more years, Elena. Just 5 more until it's perfect." He didn't know that by this time tomorrow his phone would be ringing with calls from environmental officials, that news vans would be parked outside his modest home, or that the secret he'd kept for 30 years was about to become a global sensation. Thomas just knew he needed to soak his hands in Epsom salts tonight so they'd be ready to dig again at dawn. Each tree was a letter and a love story only the sky could read, and he wasn't finished writing it yet. Thomas's daily routine had the precision of a well-calibrated clock. Awake at 5:30 a.m. regardless of season or weather. A simple breakfast of oatmeal with honey, Elena's recipe, followed by an hour tending to his greenhouse, where saplings at various stages of development thrived under his careful attention. By 8 a.m. he would begin his professional consultations, offering his botanical expertise to clients who never suspected the magnitude of the project he worked on in private. His small botanical consulting business provided just enough income to fund his true mission. Clients valued his encyclopedic knowledge of soil remediation and native plant, with a clear sense of purpose. Despite increasing physical limitations, he made his way to the forest at dawn, carrying a small box containing precious cargo, seeds collected from the very first tree he had planted, now producing its own generational continuity. At the forest's edge, he encountered a group of students from the research center, preparing for a day of fieldwork. Among them was young Elena Rodriguez, whose enthusiasm for continuing the forest's legacy reminded Thomas powerfully of his wife's passion. "Mr. Evergreen," she greeted him with evident surprise. "We didn't expect to see you here so early." Thomas smiled, holding up the small box. "I have something for you and your colleagues. Seeds from the first generation. Genetic continuity from the beginning of this project." The young scientists gathered around with reverent attention as Thomas carefully divided the seeds among them. "These aren't just for study," he instructed. "They're for planting, for starting new forests in places that need healing. Each of you comes from a different country, a different ecosystem. Take these home when your research here is complete. Plant them as the first trees in new beginnings." As he watched the young scientists carefully storing the precious seeds, Thomas felt the horizon expanding beyond even what he had previously imagined. Forests growing from these seeds in continents he would never visit, in future decades he would never witness. "The most important lesson I've learned in 35 years of planting trees," he told them, "is that healing isn't a destination we reach. It's a process we initiate, a relationship we tend, a future we make possible for others to continue." Later that afternoon, Thomas returned to the heart of the forest one final time. The physical effort of the day had taxed his aging body, but a profound sense of completion sustained his spirit. He settled on his bench, watching sunlight filter through leaves that had grown from seedlings under his care. "I think my work here is done, Elena," he said softly. "Not the forest's work, that will continue for centuries, but my part in it has reached its natural conclusion." The response came in the forest sounds he had come to interpret as conversation. Bird calls, rustling leaves, the distant gurgle of a stream that had appeared naturally 15 years into the project as the healed soil began to channel rainwater in new patterns. Thomas closed his eyes, feeling the gentle breeze against his weathered face, the same face that had grimaced with effort planting the first seedling in poisoned ground 35 years earlier. In that moment, he experienced not just the resolution of his 3-decade mission, but a horizon of possibility extending far beyond his individual life. What he and Elena had created together would continue growing, healing, inspiring long after both their names were forgotten. The heart-shaped forest would mature into an ancient woodland. The message written in trees would become part of the Earth's ongoing story of resilience and renewal. As evening approached, Thomas made his way slowly back toward the research center, where Sarah waited to drive him home. His steps were measured but purposeful, each one a farewell to the paths he had walked thousands of times. "Ready to go?" Sarah asked as he approached. Thomas paused, looking back at the forest silhouetted against the setting sun. "Yes," he said finally. "I'm ready." 3 weeks later, Thomas Evergreen passed peacefully in his sleep, 35 years and 2 months after planting the first tree in Elena's forest. The memorial service, held in the heart of his creation, drew environmental leaders, scientists, and ordinary citizens from around the world. Where his bench had stood for decades, a simple stone marker was placed, bearing no name or date, just the words Thomas had chosen himself. "Love grows here." From the International Space Station passing overhead that day, Elena's forest was clearly visible, a perfect heart embracing her name, written in trees that would continue growing, healing, and inspiring for centuries to come. What had begun as one man's private devotion had become a global symbol of love's power to transform destruction into renewal, grief into growth, ending into beginning. In forests around the world inspired by Thomas and Elena's example, new trees were planted that day. each one extending the horizon of healing beyond individual life into the shared future of the planet itself. Their ongoing dialogue. "Mr. Evergreen?" came a tentative voice from the path. Thomas turned to see a young woman approaching hesitantly, respect evident in her careful steps. He recognized her as one of the newer research fellows at the center. Elena Rodriguez, named after his wife by parents who had been inspired by the forest story. "I'm sorry to interrupt your solitude," she said, "but there's something I thought you should see." She extended a tablet displaying a satellite image unlike any Thomas had seen before. It showed not just Elena's forest, but a constellation of similar projects worldwide, heart-shaped forests in various stages of development across 6 continents. "They're calling it the Evergreen Effect," the young scientist explained. "People around the world are replicating your model, transforming contaminated sites into living memorials. Each one uses your methods, adapted to local conditions and species." Thomas studied the image with wonder, seeing his private vision multiplied across the globe. What had begun as one man's solitary grief had sparked a movement transcending language, culture, and geography. "This one in Brazil was started by a woman who lost her husband to industrial illness," Elena continued, pointing to a particular site. "This one in Australia commemorates an Aboriginal community displaced by mining. Each forest tells a unique story while contributing to global healing." Thomas handed the tablet back, momentarily overwhelmed by the scope of impact from his simple personal beginning. "Thank you for showing me this," he said quietly. After the young scientist departed, Thomas remained on his bench, absorbing the implications of what he had seen. The new horizon opening before him wasn't just the continued growth of Elena's forest, but its replication in wounded places worldwide. Each project carrying forward the methods he and Elena had pioneered, each expressing private grief through public restoration. As evening approached, casting long shadows through the trees, Thomas realized he was no longer alone. Maria Vasquez had joined him, moving carefully to sit beside him on the bench that had witnessed so many quiet conversations over the years. "Quite a day," she observed, her voice carrying the gentle rasp of advanced age. Thomas nodded. "I just learned that people are creating forests like this all over the world. Heart-shaped forests, healing toxic land." Maria smiled. "Elena always said that true love should change the world. It seems she was right." They sat in companionable silence as twilight deepened around them. After decades of friendship renewed through their shared connection to Elena, words were often unnecessary between them. "I've been thinking about horizons," Thomas said finally. "When I began this forest, my horizon was limited to my own lifetime. How many trees I could plant, how much land I could heal before my time ran out." "And now?" Maria prompted. "Now I see a horizon that extends centuries beyond me," Thomas replied. "These trees will live for generations. The research center will continue developing new remediation methods. Young scientists will carry Elena's breakthroughs to places we never imagined." Maria nodded, understanding the profound shift in perspective. "That's the true gift of what you've created, a horizon that extends beyond individual life." As darkness settled over the forest, fireflies began to appear among the trees, their gentle lights weaving patterns that seemed to echo the molecular structures of Elena's revolutionary enzymes. "I've made a decision," Thomas said after a long, comfortable silence. "I've been working with my attorneys to establish the Elena Evergreen Foundation. All of my savings, my home, everything I have will go toward supporting young scientists working on environmental restoration." "She would love that," Maria affirmed, "continuing the work through new generations." Thomas nodded, watching the fireflies with quiet appreciation. "For 35 years, I've been tending this forest as my way of keeping Elena present in the world. I've come to understand that her presence continues not just through these trees, but through every person inspired by what we created together." The new horizon Thomas envisioned wasn't simply geographical expansion or scientific advancement. It was a fundamental shift in human relationship with damaged environments, a template for transforming loss into renewal, extractive practices into regenerative care. In the days that followed the UN designation, Thomas found himself reflecting on the complete arc of his 35-year journey. What had begun in the depths of personal grief had expanded into a global model for environmental healing. The private message he had written across the landscape had become a public text, read and replicated by people he would never meet. 2 months after the ceremony, Thomas woke early one morning. Life. As the ceremony concluded and people dispersed to various parts of the research center and forest, Thomas slipped away quietly, returning to the heart of his creation. There, in the gentle evening light filtering through leaves that had grown beneath his care, he sat on his familiar bench and felt for perhaps the first time in 30 years a sense of complete peace. "We did it, Elena," he whispered to the forest that had become their shared legacy. "And now it continues without us, just as you always believed it would." 5 more years passed, marking 35 years since Thomas had planted the first seedling in toxic soil. At 79, he had gradually stepped back from daily involvement in the research center's operations, though he still maintained his private connection to the forest itself. 3 times each week, regardless of weather, he walked the paths he had created, observing changes, noting new growth, maintaining his decades-long conversation with Elena through the living medium they had created together. On this particular morning, a special occasion had drawn visitors from around the world to Elena's forest. The United Nations had designated the site as the world's first Global Remediation Heritage Area, a new category created specifically to recognize the unprecedented ecological achievement and its continuing scientific significance. As Thomas made his way slowly along the path toward the ceremony site, he used a walking stick carved from a branch of the forest's first fallen tree, a physical connection to the beginning of his journey. Age had bent his frame and whitened his hair, but his eyes remained clear and observant, missing no detail of the ecosystem he had nurtured from nothing. Sarah fell into step beside him, now a globally recognized authority on ecological restoration, thanks to her years documenting and expanding upon Thomas's methods. "How does it feel?" she asked. "To see your private project become a global model?" Thomas smiled, the expression crinkling weathered features into familiar patterns. "Like watching a child grow up. Pride mixed with the recognition that it no longer belongs just to you." They paused at a viewpoint that offered a rare ground-level perspective on the heart shape Thomas had designed decades earlier. From this angle, one could see how the different tree species created subtle variations in canopy height and color, defining the heart's outline through natural transitions rather than artificial boundaries. "The most remarkable thing," Thomas observed, "is how much of this happened without my conscious planning. Yes, I designed the overall shape and chose initial species. But the way fungi have networked beneath the soil, the bird migrations that have established new patterns, the native plants that have returned on their own, the forest has developed its own intelligence beyond my original vision." Sarah nodded. "That's become the core principle of the evergreen method we now teach, creating conditions for natural systems to heal themselves rather than imposing rigid human solutions." They continued toward the gathering, where representatives from environmental organizations, government agencies, and academic institutions awaited the formal designation ceremony. Among them, Thomas recognized Maya Westfield, now chairman of Westfield Environmental Restoration, the company transformed by its association with Elena's forest. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful. Thomas, as the forest's creator, received the official designation from the UN Secretary-General with characteristic humility. In his acceptance speech, he emphasized that the honor belonged not to him alone but to Elena's scientific vision, to the land's inherent capacity for healing, and to the community that had formed around the forest's preservation. As the formal proceedings concluded and the gathering transitioned to a more casual celebration, Thomas found himself drawn back toward the heart of the forest. The day's emotions, pride, accomplishment, bittersweet awareness of his own mortality, created a need for the familiar solitude where his journey had begun. At the central clearing, now recognized as one of the most ecologically significant sites on the planet, Thomas settled on his bench. The seedling he had planted at the forest's exact center 10 years earlier had grown into a sturdy young tree, its branches reaching toward sunlight with unmistakable vigor. "I didn't expect to live long enough to see this day," he said aloud, continuing his decades-long conversation with Elena. "To see our private message become a global model, to watch scientists from every continent study what we created together." The forest responded with its constant symphony, birds calling, leaves rustling, the subtle creaking of branches in the gentle breeze. After 35 years, Thomas had learned to interpret these sounds as responses when Elena died. "Now I understand that I was actually nurturing something that would grow beyond both of us." A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by bird song and the gentle rustle of leaves. The forest that had begun as one man's solitary mission had become a living, breathing community, not just of plants and animals, but of human purpose and scientific discovery. After a while, Sarah appeared on the path, approaching with the respectful step of someone who understands they're entering sacred space. Now the research center's director, she had grown from curious scientist to passionate advocate for Thomas's methods. "The team is gathering for the ceremony," she said softly. "Whenever you're ready." Thomas nodded but didn't immediately rise. "I'll join you shortly. I need a few more minutes here." After Sarah retreated, Thomas turned to Maria. "Elena always said that true healing isn't about returning to what was before. It's about growing into something new that honors what was lost, while embracing what remains possible." Maria smiled, tears gathering in her eyes. "That sounds exactly like her. For 30 years my healing was private, a conversation between me and these trees and Elena's memory," Thomas continued. "Now it's become something public, something shared. That transformation scared me at first. I felt exposed, vulnerable." He looked around at the thriving ecosystem that surrounded them. Birds nesting in branches, deer paths winding between trunks, fungi networking beneath the soil in complex communities invisible to the human eye. But that's how healing works, isn't it? It starts in isolation, a private wound, a personal loss. Then gradually, if we nurture it properly, it extends beyond us, becomes something others can participate in, learn from, continue. Maria took his hand, her weathered fingers intertwining with his. "That's the gift you and Elena have given all of us. Not just a restored forest, but a template for healing, both land and hearts." When they finally rose to join the gathering, at the research center, Thomas walked with the balanced step of a man who had carried a heavy burden for so long that its absence left him momentarily lighter than expected. The emotional resolution he had found wasn't what he had anticipated when planting the first seedling 30 years earlier. It wasn't an ending, but a transformation. From private grief to shared purpose, from solitary mission to community legacy. The ceremony itself was simple by design. Thomas had insisted on minimal fanfare. Scientists, students, environmental activists, and local community members gathered in the research center's atrium, surrounding a three-dimensional model of the forest that displayed 30 years of growth in accelerated sequence. Thomas stood beside this model, momentarily overwhelmed by seeing his life's work represented in such concise form. Decades of patient labor condensed into minutes of visible change. 30 years ago today, he began, voice steady, despite the emotion of the moment, I planted the first tree in what would become Elena's forest. I did it as an act of private devotion, a way to keep a promise to my wife after cancer took her from me. He gestured toward the completed model, where the heart shape and Elena's name were clearly visible from above. I never imagined that private act would become public purpose. That solitary grief would transform into shared healing. That one man planting trees would inspire a global movement for ecological restoration. Thomas paused, gathering himself. Today I planted the final tree according to my original design. Elena's name is complete. The heart that surrounds it is finished. But the forest itself will never be complete. It will continue growing, evolving, healing long after all of us are gone. The emotional resolution Thomas had sought for 30 years wasn't found in completion, but in continuation. Not in perfect closure, but in the open-ended promise of ongoing life. As he looked around at the gathered community that had formed around his initially solitary mission, he understood that the true healing had occurred not just in the land, but in the connections that had grown between people, united by purpose. The private grief that had driven him into solitude had ultimately led him back to community. The message he had written to Elena across the landscape had become legible to the world, inspiring others to write their own messages of healing and hope on wounded earth. In this expansion of meaning, this transformation of personal loss into shared renewal, Thomas found the emotional resolution that had eluded him through decades of solitary purpose. The forest would continue growing without his daily tending. Elena's scientific legacy would expand through discoveries yet unmade. The love that had inspired it all would ripple outward in widening circles of impact beyond his individual. Students and researchers, sharing practical knowledge that complemented their theoretical understanding. Weekends remained entirely his own, time for reflection and quiet communion with the living memorial that had defined his life. On this particular morning, the 30th anniversary of Elena's passing, Thomas rose before dawn and drove to the forest in darkness, as he had done thousands of times before. But today, he carried with him something special, the last seedling needed to complete the forest's design according to his original vision. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten as he made his way to the final planting site, a spot he had reserved for this moment since drawing the first maps 30 years earlier. He knelt in soil that bore no resemblance to the toxic dust he had first encountered. Rich, dark, alive with microorganisms and mycelia, the earth welcomed his hands as he prepared the hole for the seedling. "Good morning, Elena," he said softly, continuing the decades-long conversation that had sustained him through grief and purpose alike. "Today we finish what we started." The seedling in his hands was unique, a descendant of that first experimental hybrid planted 5 years earlier at the heart of the forest. Professor Reyes's team had nurtured it specifically for this moment, combining genetic material from trees Elena had loved with enhanced remediation capabilities born of her scientific breakthrough. As Thomas placed it carefully in the prepared soil, he was aware of a profound sense of completion washing through him. 30 years of steady purpose, thousands of trees planted one by one, countless hours of solitary labor, all culminating in this single, simple act. "It's done," he whispered, gently firming the soil around the seedling's base. "The message is complete." As he sat back on his heels, the rising sun broke through the eastern tree line, casting long golden rays across the forest floor. The timing seemed too perfect to be coincidence, a celestial acknowledgement of a human achievement measured in decades of devotion. Thomas remained kneeling beside the newly planted tree until the sun had fully cleared the horizon, bathing the forest in morning light. Then, with practiced movements that belied his age, he gathered his tools and made his way toward the heart of his creation. The central clearing had evolved significantly over 5 years of scientific study and preservation efforts. A simple circular path now allowed visitors to experience the forest's core without damaging delicate root systems. Informational plaques explained the remediation process and the forest's unique history. Yet the space retained its essential character, a cathedral of resilience and renewal. Thomas settled on his bench, feeling both the familiar comfort of routine and the novel sensation of a completed mission. For 30 years his purpose had been clear: finish the forest, complete Elena's name, fulfill his promise. Now, that defining purpose had been achieved. "What comes next, Elena?" he asked aloud, voicing the question that had been forming in his mind for months as the final planting approached. "I thought I might find you here," came a voice behind him. Thomas turned to see Maria Vasquez approaching along the path, moving, slowly with the aid of a cane, but with determination evident in every step. Over the past 5 years, Elena's childhood friend had become a regular presence in Thomas's life. A connection to parts of Elena he had never known. A bridge between past and present. "It's finished," Thomas said simply as she settled beside him on the bench. Maria nodded, understanding the significance of the day. "She would be so proud, Tommy. Not just of the forest, but of how you've shared it with the world." They sat in companionable silence, two elders connected by love for the same woman, watching morning light filter through branches that had grown from seedlings to mature trees under Thomas's care. "I've been thinking about the concept of resolution," Thomas said finally. "All these years I thought completing the forest would provide some final emotional closure, a period at the end of a 30-year sentence." "And it hasn't?" Maria asked gently. Thomas smiled, the expression reaching his eyes in a way that had become more common in recent years. "It's provided something different, not an ending, but a continuation. Not closure, but opening." He gestured toward the research center visible in the distance. "Young scientists come here from around the world now. They study what Elena and I created together. They take those lessons to wounded places we'll never see. The story continues, beyond us." Maria nodded, her own eyes filled with understanding. "That's how it should be. Stories that matter never truly end. They evolve, branch out, take root in new soil." "Exactly," Thomas agreed. "For 30 years I thought I was preserving what had ended. The protected area." "What happens now?" Sarah finally asked. "With the forest secured and the research center moving forward." Thomas smiled, genuine peace settling into his features. "Now I return to being a gardener. There are still sections that need completion, species that need introduction, balance that needs maintenance. The work continues, just with more hands to share it." "And personally?" Sarah pressed gently. "After 30 years of solitude, you've become something of a celebrity. Universities want you to lecture. Environmental organizations want you as a spokesperson. The public is fascinated by your story." Thomas considered this, watching a monarch butterfly drift past on morning currents. "I think perhaps Elena would say I've been alone with her memory long enough, that it's time to share what we've learned, together." He stood, stretching muscles stiff from age and tension. "For 30 years I've been having a one-sided conversation with Elena through these trees. Perhaps now it's time to expand the conversation, to include others in what we discovered about healing land and hearts." As they walked slowly along the path leading back toward the forest's edge, Thomas observed how the character of his creation had already begun to transform. Signs marked research plots where graduate students studied mycorrhizal networks. Carefully placed boardwalks protected sensitive areas while allowing visitors to experience the forest's interior. The solitary sanctuary had become a living laboratory, a classroom, a template for restoration projects worldwide. "I spent 30 years looking backward," Thomas said as they approached the area designated for the research center, "preserving a memory, keeping a promise to the past. Now I find myself looking forward instead, seeing how what Elena and I started might extend beyond both of us." The transformation wasn't just in the forest's purpose or Thomas's perspective. It was evident in his posture, his voice, his entire being. The solitary gardener who had worked for decades in private devotion had metamorphosed into something new, a living bridge between personal grief and public hope, between scientific knowledge and emotional wisdom. As they reached the forest's edge, they found Maya waiting beside her car, documents in hand and expression cautiously optimistic. "The board has requested your presence at the official announcement this afternoon," she informed Thomas. "They'd like you to help unveil the new corporate direction and research center plans." Thomas nodded, accepting this new role as he had accepted each phase of his 30-year journey, with quiet grace and steady purpose. "I'll be there," he said. "But first, I need to plant today's trees." Maya and Sarah exchanged glances, understanding that some aspects of Thomas's ritual would never change, despite the transformation of everything around it. The daily act of planting remained his personal communion with Elena, the consistent thread connecting past, present, and future. Later, as Thomas knelt in familiar soil, placing seedlings with the same care he had shown for 30 years, he reflected on the nature of transformation itself. The wasteland had transformed into forest. The corporation had transformed from destroyer to restorer. His private grief had transformed into public purpose. Yet beneath all these changes lay a constant, the love that had inspired the first seedling and would nurture the last. In this continuity within change, Thomas found the deepest meaning of his 30-year journey. What had begun as a message to Elena had become a message to the world, without diminishing its original intimacy. As he patted soil around a young oak that might live for centuries beyond his time, Thomas understood that transformation wasn't about replacing what came before, but about allowing it to evolve into new forms of significance. His love for Elena hadn't diminished by being shared with the world. It had expanded, like the forest itself, beyond what either of them could have imagined when they first stood together on poisoned ground and dreamed of renewal. 5 years had passed since the satellite discovery of Elena's forest. The Elena Rodriguez Evergreen Environmental Research Center now stood at the eastern edge of the protected land, an architectural marvel of sustainable design that seemed to grow from the earth itself rather than impose upon it. Inside its light-filled laboratories and conference spaces, scientists from around the world studied the unique remediation processes that Thomas and Elena had pioneered, applying their discoveries to toxic sites on every continent. Thomas, now 74, had established a routine that balanced his continued planting work with his role as the center's elder statesman. 3 days each week, he worked alone in the forest, completing the final sections of Elena's name. 2 days he spent mentoring, confrontation. With the future hanging in the balance, Thomas felt Elena's presence more tangibly than he had in years, not just in memory or imagination, but in the living network that surrounded him, the scientific legacy she had secretly embedded in the soil, and the heart-shaped message they had written together across the wounded land. The battle for Elena's forest had reached its defining moment. Dawn broke over the forest with gentle insistence, painting the canopy in gold and amber light. Thomas sat alone on his bench in the heart of his creation, physically and emotionally exhausted from the events of the previous night. The board meeting had continued for hours after his intervention, with Maya presenting devastating evidence that Richard had falsified the geological survey and illegally accessed confidential company communications. The outcome remained uncertain when the connection was finally severed, with the board calling an emergency recess until morning. Thomas had returned to the forest in the pre-dawn darkness, needing to reconnect with the living embodiment of his 30-year journey. As sunlight gradually filtered through the leaves, Thomas closed his eyes and listened to the forest awakening around him. Birdsong, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, the subtle creaking of branches swaying in the morning breeze. These sounds had been his companions through decades of solitary work. Now they provided a counterpoint to his racing thoughts, grounding him in the tangible results of his persistence. "I thought I might find you here," came Sarah's voice, soft, but carrying in the morning stillness. Thomas opened his eyes to see her approaching along the narrow path, 2 travel mugs in hand. He accepted the offered coffee with a grateful nod. "Any news?" he asked, the first words he had spoken since leaving the community center hours earlier. Sarah settled beside him, on the bench. "Maya called 20 minutes ago. The board voted at dawn." Thomas braced himself. "And? Richard has been removed as COO, pending investigation into the falsified survey and other ethical breaches," Sarah reported, a smile breaking through her professional demeanor. "The board has not only reaffirmed the original agreement for the research center but expanded it. They're committing additional funding and officially renaming the company as Westfield Environmental Restoration." Relief washed through Thomas in a wave so powerful it left him momentarily dizzy. 30 years of work, thousands of Saturdays, countless seedlings, endless hours of solitary devotion had been preserved in a pre-dawn vote by strangers in a corporate boardroom. "Maya's been reinstated with expanded authority," Sarah continued. She's calling it the most dramatic corporate transformation in environmental history. The press is already framing it as a watershed moment in business ethics. Thomas nodded, absorbing these developments with the measured calm that had carried him through 3 decades of patient work. The victory, while profound, felt almost secondary to the journey that had preceded it. "I've been sitting here thinking about transformation," he said finally. "Not just the corporations, but my own." Sarah waited, giving him space to formulate thoughts that had been percolating through the night. "When I started planting this forest, I was a broken man trying to keep a promise to his dying wife," Thomas continued. "The work was a way to structure my grief, to give purpose to days that would otherwise have been empty." He ran his hand along the bench's weathered wood, worn smooth by years of his own weight. "For 30 years I thought I was preserving something that had ended. My life with Elena, the bond we shared, the future we had planned together. I see now that I was actually creating something new. Not just a forest, but a continuation. A transformation of love into a different form." Sarah nodded, understanding dawning in her eyes. "From private grief to public legacy." "Exactly," Thomas agreed. "When the satellites discovered the heart shape, I felt exposed, violated even. I had created something deeply personal that suddenly became public property. But now I understand that's the natural progression of anything meaningful. What begins as personal inevitably extends beyond us." He gestured to the thriving ecosystem surrounding them. "These trees don't know they form Elena's name or a heart shape. They're just living, growing, connecting. The meaning is something we humans overlay on the natural process. And perhaps that's what all of this has been teaching me. That meaning transforms as it moves from private to shared experience." They sat in contemplative silence for several minutes, sipping coffee as the forest continued its morning awakening around them. In the distance, they could hear vehicles arriving, the day's researchers and volunteers beginning their work throughout. Dominated one wall of the shed. His fingers traced the heart shape that had defined 30 years of his life. "When will they make this official?" he asked, mind already racing through possible responses. "Thursday's board meeting," Maya answered. "Richard has the votes locked in. I'll be officially sidelined, and they'll announce the regrettable discovery that necessitates a modification to our agreement." Thomas was silent for a long moment, studying the map with the focused attention that had transformed wasteland into wonder. "Then we have 2 days," he finally said, "to save 30 years. What followed was an orchestration of resistance unlike anything Thomas had ever imagined himself capable of leading. For 3 decades he had worked in solitude and silence. Now he found himself at the center of a whirlwind of activity, coordinating a multi-pronged response with the same methodical precision he had once applied to planting patterns. By that evening, Sarah had mobilized the scientific community. Leading environmental researchers from across the country issued emergency statements on the ecological significance of the forest's unbroken remediation network. Professor Reyes and her team worked through the night to compile peer-reviewed evidence demonstrating how even limited mining would catastrophically disrupt the forest's internal communication system. Maria Vasquez activated Elena's extended family network and childhood community. By morning, hundreds of personal testimonials had been gathered, documenting the human cost of the original contamination and the cultural significance of the forest's restoration to those who had been displaced decades earlier. Thomas himself took on the most difficult task, going public with Elena's letter and the revelation about her scientific contribution to the forest. It meant sharing the most private aspects of their relationship with the world, transforming their intimate collaboration into a public narrative. The pain of this exposure was balanced by the strategic value. Elena's documented scientific breakthrough made the forest not just an environmental wonder, but a site of historical scientific significance. By Wednesday afternoon, major news networks had picked up the story. Satellite trucks once again lined the road to Thomas's house. Environmental activists began arriving by the busload, establishing a continuous presence at the forest's perimeter. Social media campaigns generated millions of engagements, with celebrities and political figures publicly pressuring Westfield's board members. Thomas watched this storm of attention with mixed emotions. The very privacy he had cherished for 30 years was now completely stripped away. Elena's scientific legacy and their personal love story had become public property, debated and celebrated by strangers. Yet he recognized the necessity of this exposure. The forest's survival required the weight of public opinion to counter corporate calculation. On Wednesday evening, as Thomas prepared for a live television interview that would be broadcast nationally, Maya arrived with news. "Richard has moved the board meeting up to tonight," she said without preamble. "They're convening via video conference in 1 hour. He's trying to get ahead of the public pressure." Thomas set aside the notes he'd been reviewing for his interview. "Can you get me into that meeting?" Maya shook her head. "I've been explicitly excluded. Richard claims I have a conflict of interest that compromises my judgment." "Then we need to bring the meeting to us," Thomas said, an uncharacteristic steel entering his voice. 30 minutes later, the small community center near the forest had been transformed into an impromptu command center. Large screens displayed the growing crowd of supporters outside Westfield's headquarters in Chicago, where activists had organized an emergency demonstration. Social media feeds showed the hashtag Save Elena's Forest trending globally. Thomas stood at the center of this activity, outwardly calm, but internally wrestling with the most intense conflict of his 30-year journey. Everything he had built, both the physical forest and the private meaning it contained, now hung in the balance. The quiet mission that had structured his grief and given purpose to his remaining years had become a public battleground. As the hour of the board meeting approached, Thomas stepped outside for a moment of solitude. The evening air carried the scent of his forest miles away but present in his consciousness like a living extension of himself. For 30 years he had spoken to Elena through that forest. Now he needed her guidance more than ever. "I've exposed our private world to save it," he whispered to the gathering darkness. "I don't know if that's what you would have wanted." The wind shifted, bringing a stronger pulse of forest scent. Thomas closed his eyes, remembering Elena's letter, her secret preparation for the work she knew he would undertake after her death. She had understood him deeply enough to anticipate his 30-year mission before he had conceived it himself. In that moment of connection across time, he found clarity. When Thomas returned to the community center, his expression had changed. Those who had come to know him over the past year recognized the transformation immediately. The quiet gardener had fully embraced his reluctant role as defender. "Maya," he called across the busy room, "I need to address the board directly." She shook her head. "They won't admit you to the meeting." "Then we'll make them listen another way," Thomas replied. "How quickly can you get us live video from the heart of the forest?" As the Westfield board meeting began in sterile corporate luxury, Thomas stood in the center of his creation, illuminated by hastily arranged lighting that cast long shadows among the trees. Behind him, the trunk of the oldest oak in the forest, the first tree he had planted 30 years earlier, provided a living backdrop that contrasted sharply with the boardroom's polished veneer. Through Maya's corporate contacts and Sarah's technical team, they had hacked into the board's video conference, projecting Thomas's feed directly into their closed meeting. The board members' shocked expressions were visible on a tablet held by one of Professor Reyes's students, giving Thomas visual confirmation that his digital intrusion had succeeded. "Ladies and gentlemen of the Westfield board," Thomas began, his normally soft voice carrying unexpected authority. "I apologize for this unorthodox interruption, but when ordinary channels of communication are closed, extraordinary measures become necessary." Richard's face appeared prominently on the tablet, fury evident. "This is a private board meeting. This intrusion is illegal, and what you're planning is a desecration," Thomas continued steadily, ignoring the interruption, "not just of a unique environmental achievement, but of a scientific legacy that belongs to humanity's future." He gestured to the forest surrounding him. 30 years ago, I began planting these trees as a private act of love and memory. I never sought recognition or reward. But what Elena and I created here has grown beyond personal meaning. It has become a template for healing our wounded planet. One by one, Thomas addressed the key arguments Richard had been using to sway the board, countering financial projections with documented evidence of the research center's long-term value, challenging the mysterious mineral survey with independent geological assessments, methodically dismantling the case for mining with the precision he had once applied to planting schedules. But beyond all these practical considerations, Thomas continued, lies a more fundamental question. What kind of company do you wish Westfield to become? One that extracts temporary profit from permanent destruction, or one that pioneers a new model of corporate environmental leadership? He paused, allowing his words to resonate in the boardroom miles away. Then, with deliberate movements, he knelt beside the massive oak behind him and placed his hand against its bark. This tree contains 30 years of growth, 3 decades of carbon sequestration, soil remediation, and ecosystem support. Like each of you, it began small, vulnerable to countless threats. Like each of you, it grew through adversity to achieve something significant. His voice softened, becoming more personal. I'm 69 years old. In the natural course of things, I have perhaps a decade left to tend this forest. But these trees will continue growing, healing, connecting for centuries after I'm gone. What we decide today ripples forward through generations yet unborn. Thomas stood facing the camera with quiet dignity. I've dedicated 30 years to proving that healing is possible, that destruction can be reversed through patience and care. Now I'm asking you to demonstrate that corporate wisdom can evolve beyond short-term extraction to long-term stewardship. The silence that followed stretched for several seconds. On the tablet screen, board members exchanged uncomfortable glances while Richard attempted to regain control of the meeting. This emotional appeal changes nothing, Richard finally declared. The geological survey clearly indicates. The survey is a fraud, came Maya's voice as she stepped into frame beside Thomas. And I can prove it. The maximum conflict that had been building for days reached its crescendo in that moment. Corporate power against grassroots passion, short-term profit against long-term healing, extraction against restoration. As Thomas stood firm among the trees he had planted one by one over 30 years, he embodied the forest's quiet persistence against seemingly insurmountable opposition. In that moment of evident, I never introduced any enzymes, just trees, companion plants, and the fungal spores I cultivated. Sarah nodded, watching him carefully. We know, which is why we did some additional research. She swiped to a new screen on her tablet. This is from the university archives, a research team working on bioremediation from 1985 to 1990. Thomas stared at the grainy photograph displaying a group of young scientists in lab coats. His breath caught as he recognized one face among them, younger but unmistakable. Elena, he whispered. Sarah nodded. She was part of a cutting-edge bioremediation research team before budget cuts ended the program. According to the records, they had developed promising enzymatic compounds but never received approval for field testing. She never told me, Thomas said, mind racing through decades of memories. She mentioned working in university research before we met, but not the specifics. There's more, Sarah said gently. We found this in the university storage archives. She handed him a sealed envelope, yellowed with age, with his name written on it in handwriting he would recognize anywhere. His hands trembled slightly as he accepted it. Where was this found? In a sealed research container alongside vials of the enzyme compound, Sarah explained. The container was labeled with instructions that it should remain sealed for 50 years. But when our research team discovered its contents and relevance to the forest, the university made an exception. Thomas stared at the envelope, 30 years of certainty suddenly wavering. Would you give me a moment alone? Sarah squeezed his shoulder as she stood. Of course. I'll be outside when you're ready. After she left, Thomas sat motionless, studying Elena's handwriting on the envelope. Finally, with careful movements, he broke the seal and extracted a single sheet of paper. A letter written in the same distinctive hand that had labeled seedlings and recorded observations in the journals surrounding him. My dearest Thomas, if you're reading this, then something extraordinary has happened. Either 50 years have passed and science has rediscovered my work, or someone has connected it to the forest I believe in my heart you have created. I have cancer. The doctors haven't told me yet, but I've seen my own test results. The same chemicals that poisoned my childhood home are now poisoning me, and I know what this means. I don't tell you this to cause pain, but to explain what I've done. For 5 years, I worked on a bioremediation enzyme that could accelerate the healing of toxic soil. When our funding was cut, I couldn't bear to let the research die. I took samples of our most promising compound and have kept them frozen, waiting for the right moment. That moment is now. I know what you'll do when I'm gone, my love. I've seen it in your eyes each time I've talked about the wasteland where I grew up. You'll try to heal it for me, tree by tree, year by year. It's who you are, the man who fixes broken things with endless patience. What I've left in this container will help. The enzymes, if used properly, can reduce the remediation timeline by decades. I've included instructions based on our research. Protocols. This is my final gift to you, and to the earth that has given us so much. A way for science and nature to work together, just as you and I have always done. Please forgive me for not telling you about this research or my diagnosis sooner. I wanted our remaining time together to be filled with life, not preparation for its end. When you plant the heart-shaped forest I know is already growing in your mind, remember that my love for you is part of the soil itself now, a catalyst for healing that will continue long after both of us are gone. Always and forever, Elena. Thomas read the letter 3 times, tears falling freely onto the paper before he carefully set it aside. After a moment he rose and walked to the shed door, opening it to find Sarah waiting patiently outside. She knew, he said simply. Not just about my plans for the forest, but about her illness before she told me. She prepared for both. Sarah nodded. The enzyme compounds she developed were revolutionary for their time. Based on our analysis, they reduced what should have been a 50 to 70-year remediation timeline to the 30 years it actually took. Thomas gazed out at the forest surrounding them, seeing it anew. All this time I thought I was having a one-sided conversation with her memory, but she was actually here, working alongside me through the science she left behind. There's something else you should know, Sarah said. The enzyme compound only worked because of the specific tree species and planting patterns you used. Elena's science was brilliant, but it needed your implementation to succeed. You were genuine partners in this creation even after she was gone. Thomas stood, silently, absorbing the profound revelation that reframed 30 years of solitary purpose as a continuing collaboration that transcended death itself. The forest had never been just his tribute to Elena. It had been their shared creation all along. I'd like to plant something new today, he said finally. Would you help me? Later that afternoon, in a small clearing at the exact center of the heart-shaped forest, Thomas knelt in the rich soil his and Elena's work had reclaimed from devastation. In his hands he held a seedling, unlike the others he had planted over 3 decades, a hybrid species developed by Professor Reyes's team that combined characteristics of Elena's favorite tree with remarkable remediation properties. The first of a new generation, he explained to Sarah, who knelt beside him with trowel in hand. Not just a memory of the past, but a bridge to the future. As they worked together to place the seedling in the ground, Thomas felt Elena's presence, more tangibly than he had in years, not as a ghost or memory, but as a continuing influence on the living world. The forest around them rustled with life, 30 years of growth creating a cathedral of renewal that would now continue evolving long after its original creators were gone. In that moment, Thomas understood with crystal clarity what he and Elena had created wasn't just a heart-shaped message visible from space. It was a template for reconciliation between human activity and natural processes, a proof that with sufficient patience, science, and love, even the most profound wounds in the earth could heal. The revelation settled into his bones with the same quiet certainty that had carried him through 30 years of solitary planting. His work had never been as solitary as he believed, and its impact would never be as private as he had intended. 2 weeks after Thomas discovered Elena's letter, the fragile peace surrounding the forest's future shattered. Thomas was meeting with the architectural team finalizing plans for the research center when Maya Westfield arrived unannounced, her usual composed demeanor replaced by barely contained fury. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. "Privately." Thomas excused himself from the meeting and led her to his shed, now serving as his unofficial office. Once inside, Maya paced the small space like a caged animal. "The board is moving to terminate our agreement," she announced. "Richard has been working behind the scenes, convincing key investors that the research center represents an unacceptable admission of corporate liability." Thomas felt his hard-won optimism draining away. "They can't simply withdraw. We have signed agreements, federal partnerships. The EPA designation is already in process." "They've found a loophole," Maya said, finally stopping her pacing to face him directly. "The original agreement specified that Westfield Development would donate the land for the research center. The board is now claiming that the specific parcel designated for donation contains previously unknown critical mineral deposits that weren't accounted for in the original assessment." Thomas's brow furrowed. "That's absurd. The entire area has been thoroughly surveyed." "They commissioned their own private geological survey," Maya explained, frustration evident in her voice. "The results conveniently indicate valuable rare earth elements in the exact section where the research center is planned. Under the terms of our agreement, this triggers a reassessment clause." "These minerals appeared rather suddenly," Thomas observed, anger building behind his calm exterior. Maya nodded grimly. "Richard isn't even trying to hide the manipulation. He told me directly that the heart-shaped forest makes for touching publicity, but doesn't serve shareholder interests. He's planning to argue that limited mining operations would be compatible with preserving most of the forest. Limited mining would destroy the mycorrhizal networks that make the forest function as a single organism," Thomas said, the scientific knowledge he'd absorbed over the past year reinforcing his emotional certainty. "It would be like performing heart surgery with a chainsaw." Maya sank into a chair, professional composure cracking. "I've been fighting this for a week, Thomas. I've called in every favor, leveraged every alliance. But Richard has been planning this coup for months, systematically turning the board against me. I'm being portrayed as an environmental sentimentalist who's forgotten her fiduciary responsibility." "What about the documents?" Thomas asked. "Elena's research on the original contamination?" "Richard is prepared to weather that storm," Maya replied. "He's convinced the board that a brief public relations crisis is preferable to decades of reduced returns from a research center instead of mining operations." Thomas stood, moving to the map of the forest, that feature of his creation. The EPA team had departed, the protesters had celebrated and dispersed, and even the news helicopters had finally retreated. For the first time since the discovery, he was alone again with Elena's trees. "I made a choice, today," he said aloud, continuing the 30-year conversation that had sustained him through grief. "I let others into our space, opened what was private to the possibility of becoming public. I hope you approve." The wind moved through the branches in response, creating the familiar whisper that had been his companion for 30 years. But now, somehow, the sound carried new meaning, not just the echo of memory, but the promise of continuation. Thomas sat on the ground, feeling the living soil beneath him, soil he had nursed back from toxic death with decades of steady care. From this vantage point, he couldn't see the heart shape or Elena's name written across the landscape. He could only see individual trees, each one known to him, each one planted with specific purpose. For 30 years he had been writing a message only visible from above. Now that message had been read, interpreted, and was being answered by a world he had never expected to reach. Thomas leaned back against a tree trunk and closed his eyes. The decisive moment behind him, the future unfolding in ways he could never have anticipated when he planted the first seedling in poisoned ground. 1 year passed with remarkable speed. The Elena Rodriguez Evergreen National Environmental Research Forest had transformed from a private memorial to a buzzing center of scientific and public activity. The architectural plans for the research center had been finalized, with construction scheduled to begin the following spring on the eastern edge of the forest, deliberately placed to avoid disrupting any of Thomas's original planting. Thomas himself had undergone a transformation nearly as profound as his forest. The solitary widower had become, somewhat reluctantly, a celebrity in environmental circles. Universities had awarded him honorary degrees. Environmental organizations had created awards in his name. Young botanists made pilgrimages to walk beside him through the forest, absorbing wisdom that had never been written in textbooks. On this particular morning, Thomas sat in what had once been his secret shed, but had now been designated as a historical preservation site, complete with informational plaques outside. He was reviewing the latest mycorrhizal network maps produced by Professor Reyes and her graduate students, marveling at the visualization of connections he had intuited but never directly observed during his decades of work. A knock at the door drew his attention. Sarah entered carrying 2 mugs of tea and a tablet under her arm. "Morning, Thomas," she said, their relationship having long since shifted from formal to friendly. "Thought you might need this. You've been in here since dawn." Thomas accepted the tea gratefully. At 69, his energy remained remarkable, but the long days of consulting on the forest's future took their toll. "Professor Reyes's mapping project is extraordinary," he said, gesturing to the papers spread before him. "Look at these fungal connections between species we thought were isolated. The entire forest is essentially functioning as a single organism." Sarah smiled at his enthusiasm. "Actually, that's related to why I came looking for you. There's something we need to discuss." She sat across from him, expression growing serious. "The latest deep soil samples have revealed something unexpected." Thomas's attention sharpened. Over the past year, comprehensive testing of the forest had produced volumes of data, most confirming what he had observed empirically over decades. Unexpected findings were rare. "What is it?" he asked. Sarah placed her tablet between them, bringing up a complex chart. "We've been puzzled by the exceptional remediation success in the central heart-shaped section. Even accounting for it being the oldest part of the forest, the soil recovery there significantly outpaces the surrounding areas." Thomas nodded. "I always attributed that to the concentrated planting density I used there. The heart was the first section I completed. I wanted it perfect for Elena." "That's what we assumed too," Sarah said. "But the chemical analysis shows something more." She zoomed in on a section of the chart. "There are compounds in the soil that accelerated the remediation process. Compounds that don't appear naturally and aren't explained by your planting methods alone." Thomas frowned, studying the data. "What kind of compounds?" "Experimental bioremediation enzymes," Sarah explained. "The kind that were being researched but never commercially deployed in the late 1980s. They're breaking down toxic compounds at rates that would have been considered impossible 30 years ago." Thomas sat back. Confusion. "Is requesting an emergency conference call with you in 15 minutes. The images of Westfield's attempted clearing operation have gone viral. There's significant political pressure building." Thomas nodded, too exhausted to feel triumph. "Have they reviewed your preliminary findings?" "That's part of the call," Dr. Harrison confirmed. "The evidence of new contamination, combined with your documented remediation success, makes a compelling case for protected status, but there are still legal complications," Thomas finished. He glanced toward Maya, who stood isolated near the tree line. "I need to speak with Ms. Westfield before the call." He crossed to where she stood, noting how her corporate armor had cracked, revealing the human beneath. She looked up as he approached, professional mask slipping back into place. "Come to gloat, Mr. Evergreen?" she asked. Thomas shook his head. "I came to offer you Elena's research." Maya blinked in surprise. "I don't understand." "Your company's history with this land is complicated," Thomas said. "So is Elena's family's history, but the future doesn't have to be defined by those complications." "Richard was right about one thing," Maya said bitterly. "The liability these documents represent would devastate what remains of our company, only if they become public," Thomas pointed out. "Which isn't what Elena would have wanted." "What did she want then?" Maya asked, genuine curiosity breaking through her defensive posture. Thomas gestured around them. This, healing, restoration, not just of the land but of the relationship between people and the earth they depend on. He took a deep breath, acknowledging the enormity of what he was about to propose. I've spent 30 years speaking to Elena through trees. I believe I know what she would say now. True remediation isn't about punishment. It's about creating conditions where new growth is possible. Maya studied him, professional calculation gradually replaced by something more human. What exactly are you suggesting? A genuine partnership, Thomas said, not a superficial compromise. Westfield Development withdraws its plans for manufacturing on this site and instead commits to expanding and supporting the forest. The Elena Rodriguez Evergreen Environmental Research Center becomes a collaborative project, a place where your company's resources meet my experience, creating a global model for corporate environmental rehabilitation. And Elena's documents? Maya asked carefully. Become part of the center's historical archive, Thomas replied. Evidence not of wrongdoing to be punished, but of a journey from destruction to restoration. A case study in corporate redemption. Maya's gaze moved from Thomas to the gathering crowd beyond the forest's edge, then to the trees themselves, living, witnesses to 30 years of patient transformation. The board would need significant convincing, she said, professional assessment returning. The financial models would have to demonstrate long-term value beyond mere publicity. Environmental research centers attract grants, educational partnerships, tourism, Thomas countered, and the reputational value of transforming from environmental villain to restoration pioneer is incalculable. Before Maya could respond, Sarah approached cautiously. Mr. Evergreen, the EPA call is ready. They're waiting for you. Thomas nodded, then turned back to Maya. 30 years ago, I made a decisive choice to transform destruction into creation. Now you face a similar moment. What kind of legacy do you want to build, Ms. Westfield? The question hung between them, heavy with implication and possibility. Maya straightened, corporate bearing returning but now informed by something more personal. I'd like to join that EPA call if possible, she said. I believe Westfield Development has an alternative proposal to present. As they walked together, toward the community center where the video conference had been arranged, Thomas felt a weight lifting, not just the immediate threat to the forest, but the burden of solitary purpose he had carried for 3 decades. The EPA call lasted nearly 2 hours, with Thomas, Maya, and Sarah presenting a united vision that clearly caught the federal officials off guard. By the end, preliminary approval had been granted for a unique designation, the Elena Rodriguez Evergreen National Environmental Research Forest, the first of its kind in the country. As they emerged from the meeting, Thomas found Maria Vasquez waiting outside, anxiety etched in her features. Is it safe? She asked immediately. Will they save it? Thomas smiled, the expression reaching his eyes for perhaps the first time, since the satellites had discovered his secret. It's more than safe, Maria. It's going to grow. That evening, as the sun set over the forest, Thomas stood at the edge of the heart-shaped clearing that formed the central, genuine. No, our meeting was strictly confidential. They hurried back toward the main path, following the growing sound of voices and machinery. Cresting a small rise, they discovered the source, a team of workers in Westfield Development uniforms unloading equipment at the edge of the forest. Among them stood a tall man directing operations with aggressive efficiency. Richard, Maya called out sharply. What are you doing here? The man turned, momentarily startled by their appearance. Maya, you're early for the preliminary survey. There is no preliminary survey, Maya snapped. All operations were suspended pending the EPA assessment. Richard's expression hardened as he noticed Thomas. The board overrode your suspension. We're proceeding with initial clearing for access roads today. He produced a document from his pocket. All perfectly legal. The 30-day EPA window is a courtesy, not a legal requirement. Thomas stepped forward, rage building within him. You're destroying 30 years of remediation work. We're developing private property, old man, Richard replied dismissively. Your little gardening project was a lovely hobby, but business is business. Maya positioned herself between them. Richard, I am still CEO of this company. You don't have authority to override my directives. A cruel smile spread across Richard's face. Actually, as of this morning's emergency board meeting, I do. Your sentimental approach to this PR problem wasn't delivering results. He handed her another document. You've been temporarily relieved of operational authority pending review. As Maya scanned the document in disbelief, Thomas watched workers beginning to mark trees with orange spray paint. Trees he had planted decades ago, had nurtured from seedlings, had named in Elena's memory. Stop, he said, voice quiet but carrying. When the workers continued, he moved toward the nearest one, physically placing himself between the man and a marked tree. I said stop. Richard signaled to two security guards who had been hanging back near the vehicles. Remove Mr. Evergreen from the property, gently but firmly. Don't touch him, Maya ordered, finding her voice again. This operation is illegitimate and potentially illegal. Richard, you've deliberately misled the board. The board sees the liability these environmental assessments represent, Richard countered. They understand that swift action is our best protection against the regulatory nightmare this forest represents. As the guards hesitated, caught between conflicting authority figures, Thomas pulled out his phone and dialed with hands that shook not with age, but with fury. Sarah, he said when she answered. They're here, at the eastern entrance. Westfield Development is trying to begin clearing operations. We need everyone, now. Richard laughed. Call whoever you want, old man. By the time your tree-hugging friends arrive, we'll have established our legal right to proceed. Thomas met his gaze steadily. You clearly don't understand what you're up against. 30 years of quiet, solitary purpose had prepared Thomas Evergreen for this moment. The moment when everything he had built faced its greatest threat. What Richard failed to comprehend was that Thomas had learned patience from trees, persistence from fungi, and resilience from the land itself. As the security guards moved toward him with reluctance born of moral uncertainty, Thomas stood his ground, one hand pressed against the rough bark of a 30-year-old oak he had planted on the anniversary of Elena's death. My wife once told me, he said, voice carrying to every worker who had paused to watch the confrontation, that the true measure of love is what you're willing to defend. The next 2 hours unfolded with breathtaking speed. Sarah arrived first, accompanied by the entire EPA assessment team and local police officers she'd contacted on the way. Cell phone footage of the confrontation, captured by one of the workers and uploaded to social media, triggered an immediate response from the community. By noon, hundreds of protesters lined the access road, many wearing t-shirts hastily printed with Save Elena's Forest, and carrying signs with Thomas's face alongside rendered satellite images of the heart-shaped forest. Richard had retreated to the edge of the property, engaged in heated phone conversations with corporate attorneys while Maya stood apart, her professional world imploding around her. The marking of trees had stopped, but the equipment remained, a visual threat to the forest's future. Thomas sat on a fallen log, watching as news helicopters circled overhead and drones darted between trees, documenting everything. The solitude he had cherished for 30 years had been irrevocably shattered, and he felt both grief and strange relief in its passing. Mr. Evergreen, Dr. Harrison approached, tablet in hand. The EPA director countered. Ground that, thanks to you, is no longer poisoned, Maya pointed out. Mr. Evergreen, I'm trying to offer a compromise that acknowledges both the past and the future. The Elena Evergreen Environmental Center would allow your methods to be taught worldwide, while whitewashing your company's responsibility for the original contamination. Thomas finished for her. And what about the fresh chemical dumps we found? The attempt to sabotage the EPA assessment? Was that also part of your compromise? Maya's expression hardened. I had nothing to do with that. If someone has been dumping chemicals, and that's still unproven, it happened without my knowledge or approval. Thomas studied her. uncertain whether to believe her. And the timing of your land purchase? Just as the heart shape was becoming clearly visible from satellite imagery? Corporate real estate acquisitions take months of planning, Maya said, though a flicker of discomfort crossed her features. The satellite image timing was coincidental. They resumed walking, the beauty around them now tainted by the weight of history and opposing interests. Thomas led them deeper into the forest toward its heart, literal and figurative. Did Elena know? He finally asked. About her father's alleged sabotage? Maya shook her head. Our research suggests she didn't. The case was hushed up by both sides, the company to avoid scrutiny of their environmental practices, and the community to protect one of their own. Thomas absorbed this in silence, mind racing through decades of conversations with Elena, searching for hints he might have missed. I need to show you something, he said suddenly, veering off the main path onto a less traveled track. Something that might change how you see all of this. Maya followed him through increasingly dense vegetation until they reached a small clearing Thomas had rarely shown to anyone. In the center stood a simple wooden structure, a tiny weathered shed nearly hidden by surrounding foliage. My first headquarters, Thomas explained, unlocking the padlock with a key he kept always on his person, where I stored my early records. Inside, the simple space was lined with metal filing cabinets and shelves sagging under the weight of old journals. A desk against one wall held an ancient computer that hadn't been powered on in years, and maps covered every available surface. Thomas went to a specific cabinet, unlocking it with another key and extracting a thick folder bound with twine. Elena's research, he explained. She was collecting evidence of the plant's environmental violations for years before she got sick. He laid the folder on the desk, untying it carefully. Inside were hundreds of pages of meticulously documented soil samples, water tests, cancer cluster statistics, and corporate memoranda acquired through unknown means. She never told me exactly how she obtained some of these documents, Thomas said, moving aside to let Maya examine them. I assumed she had sources inside the company, former colleagues perhaps. Maya flipped through the pages with growing discomfort, recognizing internal communications that should never have left company archives. These would constitute substantial evidence of corporate negligence, she finally said, her professional tone unable to mask her shock. If these had been presented in court, Elena never got the chance, Thomas said simply. When her diagnosis came, fighting her cancer took precedence over fighting the company. After she died, I chose a different form of justice. Maya closed the folder carefully. Does anyone else know these documents exist? Thomas shook his head. Until this moment they've remained private, like the forest itself. Why show me now? Maya asked, clearly rattled. Thomas turned to face her directly. Because you need to understand that this isn't just about one man's memorial to his wife. Elena didn't just dream of seeing this land green again. She fought to hold accountable those who destroyed it. The forest is both a testament to her vision and a living indictment of corporate irresponsibility. He gestured toward the door. I could release these documents to the press tomorrow. Combined with evidence of fresh contamination potentially linked to your company, they would create a public relations nightmare far beyond the current situation. Maya's corporate composure slipped completely. Are you threatening me, Mr. Evergreen? I'm offering a different kind of compromise, Thomas replied calmly. One that honors both Elena's environmental vision and her pursuit of justice. As they emerged from the shed back into the sunlight, a flutter of movement caught their attention. Birds scattered from nearby trees as the sound of multiple vehicles reached them. Engines far too loud for the EPA's careful scientists. Were you expecting company? Thomas asked sharply. Maya's confusion appeared. On his porch watching fireflies rise from his garden, the same species that had reappeared in Elena's forest after 20 years of remediation. His phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Mr. Evergreen? Maya Westfield's voice came through, smooth and controlled. I think it's time we spoke privately, just the two of us. There are aspects to this situation that you might not be aware of, aspects that involve Elena directly. Thomas's hand tightened on the phone. What do you mean? Meet me tomorrow morning at the eastern entrance to the forest, she replied, avoiding his question. No lawyers, no scientists, no cameras, just a conversation between two people with different visions for the same piece of land. After she hung up, Thomas sat motionless, fireflies dancing around him in the gathering darkness. For the first time in 30 years, he felt uncertain about what Elena would want him to do. Dawn broke with unusual clarity, the air washed clean by the previous day's rain. Thomas arrived at the eastern entrance to the forest 30 minutes early, needing time to center himself before confronting Maya Westfield. This particular approach had always been his favorite, a winding path through the oldest trees, leading gradually toward the heart of his creation. Good morning, Mr. Evergreen. Thomas turned to find Maya Westfield approaching alone as promised, dressed with surprising practicality in jeans and hiking boots. Though her blazer maintained a touch of corporate formality, she carried a leather portfolio under one arm. Ms. Westfield, Thomas acknowledged with a curt nod. Thank you for meeting me, she said, her tone more personal than he'd heard before. I thought walking through the forest might help us understand each other better. Thomas studied her skeptically but gestured toward the path. This way. They walked in silence for several minutes, Maya taking in the transformation around them with expressions that shifted between clinical assessment and genuine appreciation. Birdsong filled the canopy above, and morning light filtered through leaves in dappled patterns across the forest floor. It truly is remarkable, she finally said. The satellite images don't capture the sensory experience, the sounds, the smells, the feeling of... She hesitated, searching for the right word. Life, Thomas supplied. You're feeling life where there was once only death. Maya nodded, stopping to examine a particularly large oak. How old is this one? 28 years, Thomas answered. One of the first 100 I planted. Elena and I had our 20th anniversary the week I put it in the ground. Maya ran her hand along the bark, seemingly lost in thought. Mr. Evergreen, what do you know about the original contamination of this land? Thomas frowned at the unexpected question. I know what everyone knows. The chemical plant operated for 23 years, dumped illegally, then declared bankruptcy, and abandoned the site when regulations finally caught up to them. The land was deemed too expensive to remediate through conventional means. And did Elena ever talk about her family's connection to the chemical plant? Maya asked, watching him carefully. Thomas's frown deepened. Her father worked there briefly. Lost his job when they closed. Maya opened her portfolio and handed him a document, a yellowed newspaper clipping featuring a black and white photograph of a man being led away in handcuffs. Manuel Rodriguez, Maya said as Thomas stared at the image, Elena's father. Thomas's eyes moved from the photo to the headline. Local man arrested for industrial sabotage. What is this? He demanded, a cold feeling spreading through his chest. In 1972, Manuel Rodriguez was arrested for deliberately damaging equipment at the chemical plant, causing significant toxic releases into the surrounding land, Maya explained. He believed the company had stolen his family's farmland through predatory practices and wanted revenge. The case was later dismissed due to insufficient evidence, but internal company records were quite clear about his culpability. Thomas handed the clipping back, his hand steady despite the turmoil inside. Why are you showing me this? Maya took a deep breath. Because Westfield Development is a subsidiary of North Star Chemical Holdings. We're the corporate descendants of the original company that operated the plant. The revelation struck Thomas like a physical blow. He leaned against a nearby tree, piecing together the implications. So this isn't about building a new facility. It's about covering up old crimes. It's more complicated than that, Maya insisted. Yes, there's corporate liability to consider, but there's also opportunity for redemption. The manufacturing facility we're proposing would employ locally, with state-of-the-art environmental safeguards. Built on poisoned ground you never bothered to clean up. Thomas, memory. First time I saw deer tracks, I wept. Proof that larger wildlife was returning, that the ecosystem was becoming real. Sarah watched him carefully, noting how his expression softened when he spoke of these milestones. You've been measuring success differently than we scientists do, she observed. Thomas nodded. Science counts species diversity and soil composition. I counted heartbeats returning to dead land. The rain intensified, creating a cocoon of sound around them. In the distance, they could see the EPA team working under portable canopies, meticulously cataloging Thomas's miracle with scientific precision. The contamination we found at the perimeter, Sarah said hesitantly. The lab confirmed it's fresh industrial solvent, similar to what the original plant produced decades ago, deliberately dumped within the last month. Thomas's jaw tightened. Westfield Development? We can't prove anything yet, Sarah cautioned, but the timing is suspicious. The company submitted their land purchase application just 6 weeks ago. They knew what they were doing, Thomas said quietly, creating a reason for the EPA to deny protected status. Perhaps, Sarah conceded. But they underestimated what you've created. The forest is fighting back. Thomas turned to her, questioning. The newest contaminants aren't spreading as they would in normal soil, she explained, professional excitement breaking through. The mycelial networks you've established are already beginning to isolate and process the toxins. It's as if the forest has developed an immune system. Thomas sat with this revelation, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. All these years he'd seen himself as the forest's protector. The notion that his creation might now protect itself, might have an existence and resilience beyond his stewardship, shifted something fundamental in his understanding. I always thought this forest was my gift to Elena, he said finally, but maybe it was her gift to me. A purpose. A way to heal when I thought healing was impossible. Or perhaps, Sarah suggested gently, it's a gift you've both given to the future. Later that afternoon, Thomas found himself in an unfamiliar position, standing before cameras in the community center, preparing to address the growing movement that had formed around his forest. Maria Vasquez sat in the front row, alongside a dozen of Elena's childhood friends and relatives who had made pilgrimages since the news broke. Behind them, environmental activists and local residents packed the space to capacity. I'm not a public speaker, Thomas began awkwardly. For 30 years, the only conversations I had were with trees and with my wife's memory. A gentle laugh rippled through the audience, breaking the tension. I never intended for anyone to see what I was doing, he continued, gaining confidence. The heart shape, Elena's name, those were private messages written in a language only the sky could read. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But standing in the forest this morning, watching scientists document what's grown there, I realized something important. While I was focused on remembering the past, preserving Elena's memory, she was always focused on the future, on what the land could become long after we were gone. Thomas cleared his throat, emotion threatening to overwhelm him. 30 years ago, I thought I was starting a project I would finish alone. Now I understand I was really starting something that would outlive me, something that would bring people together long after I'm gone. Maria nodded encouragingly from the front row, tears tracking silently down her weathered cheeks. The Westfield Development Company has legal rights to the land, Thomas acknowledged, bringing murmurs of discontent from the crowd. But I believe Elena's forest has earned the right to exist on its own terms, not as my memorial or my creation, but as a living entity with its own future. From the back of the room, reporters' cameras flashed as Maya Westfield slipped in, accompanied by a single assistant. Her expression remained carefully neutral as Thomas continued. I've spent 30 years speaking to this forest, Thomas said, his voice gaining strength. Now I'm asking all of you to help it speak for itself, not just as a symbol of one man's devotion, but as proof that healing is possible. Even in places we've given up for dead. The applause was immediate and thunderous. As Thomas stepped away from the microphone, overwhelmed by the response, he caught Maya Westfield's calculating gaze across the room. For 30 years he had been a solitary gardener, speaking only to ghosts and saplings. Now, suddenly, he found himself a reluctant general in a battle for the future of a forest that had become something far greater than his private memorial. The perspective shift left him dizzy with implications and possibilities. That night, as Thomas sat, after high school, "Elena always regretted losing touch with you. Life scatters us," Maria said simply. "But some connections remain." She reached into her purse and withdrew a faded photograph. Two young girls standing before a farmhouse, surrounded by sunflowers. This was taken the summer before the plant came, when everything was still alive and beautiful. Thomas accepted the photograph with trembling hands, recognizing a teenage Elena with her arm around her friend. "I've never seen this," he whispered. "She lost all her childhood photos in the movie." "I have more," Maria said. "Albums full, I brought them all." As they spoke, sharing memories of the woman whose absence had shaped both their lives, Thomas became aware of an expanding circle forming around them. Others were stepping forward, former neighbors, distant relatives, old schoolmates of Elena's, all drawn by the news story, all bearing fragments of the past Thomas had never known. "She used to organize nature walks for the neighborhood kids," one elderly man recalled. "Kept every injured bird or rabbit we ever found," another added. "Always said the land would come back someday," Maria remembered, even when everyone else gave up hope. Thomas listened, each story illuminating new facets of the woman he'd loved. In 30 years of mourning Elena, he'd preserved her in amber, a perfect, unchanging memory. Now she was expanding through these connections, becoming more complex, more real, more present. Across the room, Maya Westfield watched the impromptu reunion with calculation. "This complicates our narrative," she murmured to her assistant. "Find out everything you can about Elena Rodriguez Evergreen. We need to understand what we're up against." Professor Reyes approached Thomas gently. "Mr. Evergreen, these connections aren't just happening with people. The mycelial networks you've established in the forest are creating connections that strengthen the entire ecosystem. What you've built is more than a memorial. It's a community." Thomas looked around the room at the unlikely gathering. All, connected through Elena, through the land, through his 30 years of solitary purpose suddenly transformed into a collective mission. "Perhaps," he said thoughtfully, "that's what she intended all along." 3 days into the EPA's assessment, Thomas stood at the edge of what he still thought of as Sector E12, though the scientists had renamed it Northeast Quadrant 3 in their methodical documentation. A light rain fell, transforming his forest into a glistening cathedral of greens and browns. The sound of water droplets hitting leaves created a percussion that had become, over 30 years, the soundtrack of his devotion. "You usually worked alone in weather like this," Sarah observed, holding an umbrella over them both. She'd taken to accompanying him on his daily inspections, her scientific curiosity gradually giving way to genuine appreciation for the man behind the miracle. Thomas nodded, eyes tracking a pair of cardinals flitting between branches. Rain days were Elena's favorite. She said you could almost hear the trees drinking. Sarah smiled at the image. "The preliminary soil tests are remarkable, Mr. Evergreen. The mycorrhizal networks you've established have sequestered toxic compounds in ways we've only theorized. Dr. Patel is calling it the Evergreen Method." Thomas's weathered face crinkled with amusement. "There's no method, just patience and observation." "That is the method," Sarah insisted. "Modern remediation is all rapid intervention and engineered solutions. You've demonstrated that partnering with natural processes, even if it takes decades, produces more profound healing." They walked in companionable silence, following a narrow path that wound through the oldest section of trees. Here, where Thomas had begun his work 30 years earlier, the forest had matured into something self-sustaining. Fallen logs hosted mushrooms that continued the work of remediation. Understory plants Thomas had never introduced had found their way here naturally, transported by wind or birds or other mysterious means. "It's no longer just my creation," Thomas said, voicing the realization that had been forming over the past week. It's become something more, something with its own life. Sarah nodded encouragingly. That's the miracle of what you've accomplished. You didn't just plant trees, you restarted an ecological process that's now self-perpetuating. They reached a small clearing where a stone bench, the only human structure Thomas had permitted himself to add, faced eastward. He sat, feeling the familiar contours weather-worn to fit his body after countless Saturdays of rest between planting sessions. I built this the first year, he explained as Sarah settled beside him. Used to eat my lunch here and talk to Elena. Tell her about each tree, each new bird species that arrived. He smiled at her, deliberately. Before we discuss any compromise, I think we need to determine who stands to benefit from ensuring this forest never receives protected status. The accusation hung in the air between them, clear though unspoken, as cameras clicked, in the distance. The community center in the small town nearest to Elena's forest, as locals had already begun calling it, had never hosted such a diverse gathering. Environmental activists mingled with university researchers. Retired chemical plant workers sat uncomfortably beside the families who had lost loved ones to industrial illness. Local politicians hovered near the refreshment table, gauging the room's temperature before committing to a position. At the center of it all stood Thomas, unaccustomed to the spotlight, yet somehow holding his ground with quiet authority. 3 days had passed since the confrontation with Maya Westfield, and the story had only grown. National environmental organizations had pledged support. Crowdfunding campaigns to save Elena's forest had raised nearly $1 million. Celebrities were tweeting about the ultimate love story written in trees. All these people, Catherine murmured beside him, for something you did alone in silence for 30 years. Thomas scanned the room, overwhelmed. Not for me, for the forest. Dr. Harrison approached with a young woman Thomas didn't recognize. Mr. Evergreen, I'd like you to meet Professor Gabriela Reyes from the university's Environmental Science Department. She's our foremost expert on bioremediation. The woman extended her hand, eyes bright with genuine admiration. Mr. Evergreen, your methods are revolutionary. The mycorrhizal network you've established throughout the contamination zone demonstrates principles we've only theorized. I've studied remediation sites worldwide, and I've never seen results like yours. Thomas accepted her handshake with a humble nod. I just did what the land told me it needed. Listen more than I dictated. That's exactly what makes your approach so effective, Professor Reyes insisted. Conventional remediation imposes solutions. You've collaborated with natural processes, accelerating what the Earth wanted to do anyway. She hesitated. I understand your work is deeply personal, but would you consider allowing my graduate students to document your methods? The applications for other contaminated sites could be transformative. Before Thomas could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew everyone's attention. Maya Westfield had arrived with her entourage, commanding the room with corporate confidence despite the palpable hostility directed her way. Brave of her to come, Dr. Harrison murmured. Thomas watched the businesswoman navigate the crowd, noting how the sea of people parted before her. Or calculated, he replied. When Maya reached them, she addressed Thomas directly, ignoring the scientists flanking him. Mr. Evergreen, I've come with a proposal that might satisfy all parties. She gestured to an aide who unrolled architectural plans on a nearby table. Westfield Development is prepared to modify our project to preserve 60% of the forest, including the heart shape and your wife's name. The room fell silent, all eyes on Thomas. And the remaining 40%? He asked, voice steady. Would be cleared for our manufacturing facility, she confirmed. But we would establish a Thomas and Elena Evergreen Environmental Education Center on the premises, showcasing your remarkable work and teaching your methods to future generations. Thomas studied the plans, face impassive. You're offering to put my wife's name on a building while destroying part of what I created to honor her memory. Maya's professional smile tightened. Mr. Evergreen, we're offering a compromise that preserves your legacy while creating jobs this community desperately needs. The land, legally speaking, isn't yours. The land belongs to itself, came a new voice, strong and clear. Thomas turned to see an elderly woman making her way toward them, supported by a middle-aged man who shared her distinctive features. Something about her seemed vaguely familiar, though Thomas couldn't place her. Maria Vasquez, the woman introduced, herself extending a weathered hand to Thomas. I grew up 2 houses down from Elena Rodriguez before she became Elena Evergreen, before the chemical plant came and drove us all away. Thomas took her hand, recognition dawning. Elena's childhood friend. She spoke of you often. Maria nodded, eyes bright with unshed tears. When I saw the news, I couldn't believe it. All these years you've been healing the land that broke our hearts. She gestured to the man beside her. My son Miguel brought me from Arizona. I had to see it. Had to thank you. The corporate pitch forgotten, Thomas led Maria to a chair. Memories, flooding back of Elena's stories about her childhood friend who'd moved away, attempting to maintain professional composure. Mr. Evergreen, your work represents the most successful private environmental restoration project ever documented. But there's a complication. Thomas's expression hardened. What complication? The satellite images have been noticed by more than just our team. They've been picked up by several environmental news outlets already. By tomorrow, your forest will likely be national news. Thomas stood abruptly, hands gripping the edge of the table. No, that's not acceptable. This is private, sacred ground. I'm afraid it's too late, Sarah said gently, turning her tablet, to show him the trending news article already garnering thousands of shares. Mystery Heart, the incredible forest that love built. Thomas sank back into his chair, face pale. 30 years without anyone noticing, and now this? I'm not finished yet. The project needs 5 more years at minimum before the ecological balance is self-sustaining. That's actually why we're here, Dr. Harrison explained. Your forest sits on land recently purchased by Westfield Development Corporation. They plan to clear a significant portion for a manufacturing complex. The blood drained from Thomas's face. They can't. That land is technically private property, Dr. Harrison finished grimly. But your work has created something extraordinary. With your permission, we'd like to document your methodology and petition for ecological protected status, based on the unique bioremediation accomplishments. It's a long shot, but do whatever you need to do, Thomas cut in, newfound determination, hardening his voice. But I need to keep working. I have 5 more years of planting scheduled, and I won't stop until Elena's forest is complete. Sarah exchanged glances with her colleagues before addressing Thomas directly. Mr. Evergreen, would you be willing to share your story publicly? People are already captivated by the satellite images alone. If they understood the love and science behind this project, Thomas stared out the window toward the direction of his forest, miles away but as present in his heart as Elena herself. For 30 years, his mission had been a private conversation between himself and his late wife. Making it public felt like a betrayal of that intimacy. Yet if publicity could save the forest, I'll do what's necessary to protect her legacy, he finally conceded. But on one condition. When this is over, regardless of the outcome, I continue my work without interference. As the scientist prepared to leave, formulating plans for soil samples and documentary evidence, Sarah paused at the door. Mr. Evergreen, may I ask one personal question? Thomas nodded warily. Did you ever consider that someone might see your message from above? That one day it would be discovered? Thomas looked at the worn wedding band that had never left his finger. Elena once told me that true love shouldn't need witnesses to exist, but his voice softened. She also believed that healing should be shared, so others might find hope. He looked directly at Sarah. Perhaps it's time for both the love and the healing to be witnessed. After they left, Thomas stood alone in his kitchen, feeling exposed in a way he hadn't in decades. Tomorrow would bring cameras and questions, strangers trampling through the narrative of his grief and devotion. For 30 years he had moved through the world like a ghost, visible but unseen. Now, suddenly, he would be witnessed. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episode. By dawn, they had arrived. Thomas watched from his porch as news vans lined his quiet street, reporters checking their reflections in car windows, and camera operators adjusting equipment. His phone had been ringing since midnight. Journalists, environmental organizations, even Hollywood producers seeking rights to his story. He'd unplugged it after the 12th call. "You don't have to speak to any of them," Catherine said, having driven 3 hours after his rare late-night call for support. His sister sat beside him on the porch swing, 2 steaming mugs of coffee between them. "Tommy, you could just leave for a few days. Stay with me until this blows over." Thomas shook his head, watching as Sarah Chen's car pulled up, followed by a government vehicle with EPA markings. "Running won't save Elena's forest, and this won't blow over." Catherine squeezed his hand. "All these years digging and planting in secret. I knew you were doing something with trees, but this—" She gestured toward the tablet between them, displaying the aerial images that had captured the world's imagination overnight. "It's beautiful, Tommy." She would have been so proud. "It's not finished," Thomas replied, the words carrying the weight of his new reality. For decades, time had been his ally, endless Saturdays stretching before him. These soil sample comparisons. Someone has been using advanced mycoremediation techniques combined with specialized nitrogen-fixing species introduction. This is textbook ecological succession manipulation, but executed with a level of patience and precision that's, well, almost romantic. The room fell quiet at that observation. There was something undeniably intimate about the heart and name written across the landscape. This wasn't just science, it was a message. "I think we need to find out who Elena is," Sarah said finally, "and who's been writing her name across the earth." 200 miles away, Thomas was kneeling in soft, dark soil that had once been toxic dust. Today's section was part of the final letter, the sweeping curve of the A that would complete Elena's name. He worked methodically, creating precise holes for the seedlings he'd nurtured for 3 years in his greenhouse. Each tree represented a specific memory. This one, a sturdy oak now ready for transplanting, had germinated the day he'd found Elena's old diary, recording her childhood dreams of becoming an environmental scientist before poverty and family obligations had redirected her path. The next seedling, a silver maple, marked the anniversary of their first dance when she'd told him her vision for healing the land where she'd grown up. Thomas was so absorbed in his planting that he didn't notice the drone hovering high above, photographing his solitary figure amid the vast pattern only visible from the air. Nor did he register the distant hum of vehicles approaching on the rarely used access road behind him. It was only when shadows fell across his work area that Thomas looked up, squinting against the sun to see 3 individuals standing at the edge of his clearing, a woman and 2 men in matching windbreakers with the Environmental Restoration Institute logo embroidered on the breast pockets. "Mr. Evergreen?" the woman called, taking a tentative step forward. "Thomas Evergreen?" Thomas froze, dirt-covered hands still cradling a seedling. In 30 years, no one had ever approached him here. This place existed in a separate dimension from his regular life, a sanctuary where only he and Elena's memory dwelled. "How do you know my name?" he asked, his voice rough from hours of silence. The woman held up a tablet displaying the satellite image of his creation, the heart and name visible in their entirety from above. "Because we found your message, Mr. Evergreen, and we've been trying to understand how you've accomplished the impossible." Thomas looked at the image, the first time he'd ever seen his life's work from this perspective. For decades, he'd been working with faith alone, trusting his calculations and maps without ever witnessing the complete picture. Seeing it now, fully realized, something broke open inside him. 30 years of solitary purpose, of private communion with Elena's memory, suddenly exposed to strangers' eyes. The seedling slipped from his trembling hands as tears carved clean tracks down his soil-dusted face. "I'm not looking for recognition," Thomas said firmly, pouring tea for his unexpected visitors at his kitchen table later that afternoon. He'd reluctantly agreed to bring them back to his home after they'd promised not to disturb his planting site further, without his permission. Sarah Chen studied the remarkable man before them. His hands, though gnarled with age and labor, moved with surprising grace as he arranged cups and saucers. The walls around them were covered with botanical sketches and photographs of forest progression. "Recognition isn't what we're offering, Mr. Evergreen," Dr. Harrison explained. "What you've accomplished is scientifically groundbreaking. You've successfully remediated land that experts deemed beyond recovery. The ecological significance alone—" "I didn't do it for science," Thomas interrupted, a hint of irritation creeping into his otherwise gentle demeanor. "I did it for Elena." A heavy silence filled the room. Sarah glanced at the framed photograph. On the side table, a striking woman with laughing eyes and dark hair streaked with premature silver, standing beside a younger Thomas amid a garden in full bloom. "Your wife?" she asked softly. Thomas nodded, the simple movement carrying the weight of decades of grief and purpose. "She grew up in that wasteland when it was still farmland, before the chemical plant came. Watched her childhood home turn to poison. She made me promise we'd see it green again someday." His voice faltered. "Cancer took her before we could, so I decided to keep my promise anyway." Dr. Patel leaned forward, academic interest momentarily overshadowed by human connection. "And the heart shape? The name visible only from above?" A smile touched Thomas's weathered face. "She always said love should be able to change the world. I wanted to prove she was right." Dr. Harrison cleared his throat, visibly moved, but resilience, skills he'd originally developed during his 27-year career at the university before early retirement. What they didn't know was that every dollar not allocated to his modest living expenses went toward his secret reforestation project. The unassuming ranch-style house where Thomas lived still bore Elena's touches 15 years after her passing. Her watercolor paintings of woodland scenes adorned walls with faded optimism. The kitchen remained exactly as she had arranged it, down to the herb pots on the windowsill, now tended by Thomas with religious devotion. Her gardening hat still hung by the back door, thread-worn and sun-bleached but never moved. Neighbors in the quiet suburban community regarded Thomas with the benign curiosity reserved for gentle eccentrics. The widow who disappeared every weekend with his truck loaded with mysterious supplies. The man who politely declined social invitations, yet always remembered everyone's birthdays with gifts of rare potted plants. The botanical expert who transformed his yard into a miniature arboretum, but never mentioned the Olympic-scale project consuming his life. "Morning, Mr. Evergreen?" called Mia, the 12-year-old from next door who often helped Thomas with his home garden after school. "Are the monarch eggs hatching yet?" Thomas smiled, pausing his porch sweeping. "2 emerged just this morning. Come by after school if you'd like to see them before I release them." These small connections were the extent of Thomas's social life, brief, pleasant interactions that never delved beneath the surface. Only his sister Catherine knew fragments of his weekend activities, and even she didn't grasp their full scope. Their Sunday phone calls followed a predictable script. "You're working too hard, Tommy," she would say. "Elena wouldn't want you. Killing yourself with this mystery project of yours." "It's not killing me," he would always answer. "It's keeping me alive." And it was true. While his contemporaries withered in retirement, sinking into armchairs and health complaints, Thomas remained vibrant despite his aches. His purpose sustained him through grief that might otherwise have been terminal. Each sapling represented another day with meaning, another promise kept. In his home office, behind a rotating bookshelf straight out of a mystery novel, Thomas kept his true life's work. Floor-to-ceiling maps tracking 30 years of progress. Soil sample analyses from hundreds of test sites across the wasteland. Journals filled with observations of how different species thrived or struggled in the gradually healing earth. And photographs, thousands of them, documenting the transformation from lifeless gray soil to the beginnings of an ecosystem. The most treasured photo sat on his desk. Elena at 23 standing in that barren wasteland, arms spread wide as if embracing the emptiness, her face alight with the vision of what could be. "Someday," she'd told him that day, "I want to come back and find this place green again. To know that healing is possible, even here." By the time cancer linked to environmental toxins took her at 53, the land remained unchanged. AEI, monument to industrial indifference. That night, as Thomas sat hollow-eyed beside her hospital bed, he made his promise. The land would become green again, even if he had to make it happen one tree at a time. He never imagined anyone would discover his work before it was complete. Dr. Marcus Harrison squinted at the high-resolution satellite images now projected onto the conference room wall. What had seemed merely curious in Sarah's midnight email now appeared genuinely extraordinary in the harsh light of morning. The heart-shaped forest covered nearly 800 acres, with a perfectly executed cursive Elena inscribed within it, using distinctive redwood trees that stood taller than the surrounding native species. "This isn't natural succession," Dr. Harrison stated, addressing the hastily assembled environmental team. The soil reports from this area indicated toxic levels of chemical contaminants that should have prevented any significant growth. Somebody's been systematically remediating and planting this site for years. Sarah zoomed in on several areas. Based on growth patterns and historical imagery, this project has been ongoing for approximately 30 years. The remarkable thing is that it doesn't match any registered environmental remediation project in our database. Whoever did this hasn't sought credit, funding, or recognition. And they've done it right under everyone's nose, added Dr. Patel, the team's senior soil specialist. This land was written off as a permanent loss by the EPA in the 90s. Nobody's been monitoring it because nobody thought there was anything worth monitoring. A young intern raised her hand tentatively. What's most impressive isn't just the scale, it's the methodology. Look at